Disabled CEO adopted a 5-year-old girl no one wanted. To his surprise, she miraculously healed his legs. Before we begin the story, leave in the comments which city you are watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The social worker stared at Wesley Grant with barely concealed disbelief. She said, "Mr. Grant, I have to be honest with you. In my 23 years of doing this job, I have never had a billionaire request to adopt a child that every other family has rejected." Wesley sat motionless in his wheelchair, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the file folder in her hands. He said, "And I have never had someone question my decisions this many times in a single conversation. Is there a problem with my application?" The social worker shifted uncomfortably. She said, "No, sir. Your background check is spotless. Your financial resources are obviously more than adequate. It is just," she hesitated, glancing at the wheelchair before quickly looking away. "This particular child has significant challenges. She has not spoken a single word in 6 months. She has been through 3 foster homes in that time because no family could handle her. She requires specialized care, patience, and honestly," she paused, "she requires someone who can physically keep up with a 5-year-old. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to press against the walls of the office. Wesley's voice came out cold, controlled, and sharp enough to cut glass. He said, "Are you suggesting that because I cannot walk, I cannot be a father?" The social worker's face flushed red. She stammered, "No, I did not mean. I was simply trying to." Wesley leaned forward in his wheelchair, and despite being seated, his presence filled the entire room. He said, "Let me tell you something about that little girl. Her mother was my sister. My sister who I had not spoken to in 7 years because I was too proud, too busy, too consumed with building an empire that means absolutely nothing to me now. My sister died alone on a highway while I was sitting in a boardroom discussing quarterly profits." His voice cracked almost imperceptibly before he regained control. He continued, "That child has no one left in this world. No one except me. And I may not be able to walk, but I can promise you this. I will never, ever abandon her the way I abandoned her mother. Now bring me my niece." The social worker opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. And somewhere down the hallway, a 5-year-old girl with tangled auburn curls and a one-eared stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest was about to meet the one person who would change everything. The doctors said he would never walk again. His family said he would never love again. But a 5-year-old girl who had not spoken a single word in 6 months saw something in him that everyone else had missed. Have you ever felt so broken that you wondered if the pieces could ever fit back together? Have you ever looked in the mirror and not recognized the person staring back at you? Have you ever believed, truly believed, that your best days were behind you and that the rest of your life would just be a slow, painful fade into nothing? Wesley Grant felt all of those things, every single day, and then a silent little girl took his hand, and everything changed. What happens when a man who cannot walk meets a girl who will not speak? What happens when 2 broken souls find each other in the darkness? Stay until the end of this story, because the answer will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this incredible journey, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Trust me, you are going to want to be here for every twist and turn of what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from today. I love knowing who is joining me on these journeys. Now let me take you back to where it all began. Boston, a rainy afternoon in late October. 42 stories above the city streets, a man sat alone in an office that cost more than most people's houses, staring out a window at a world he could no longer be part of. The wheelchair felt like a prison made of chrome and leather. Wesley Grant watched the city pulse with life far below him. People moved like ants across the rain-slicked sidewalks, running to catch buses, walking dogs through the park, dancing around puddles with the casual grace that comes from having 2 working legs. Simple acts, ordinary movements, things Wesley had done 1,000 times without a single thought. Now those movements existed only in his memories and in the phantom sensations that sometimes woke him at 3 in the morning, convinced he could still feel his toes curling against cold hardwood floors. He could not feel them. He had not felt anything below his waist in 18 months. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. There was nothing special about that Tuesday, nothing that should have marked it as the day Wesley Grant's life would split into before and after. He had been driving home from the office at 10:30 at night, tired from another 16-hour day, thinking about the meeting scheduled for the next morning. A drunk driver ran a red light, going 65 miles per hour. 3 seconds. That is all it took. 3 seconds of screeching tires and shattering glass, and the sickening crunch of metal folding around his body. When Wesley woke up in the hospital 4 days later, the first thing he saw was the neurologist's face. And he knew. Before the doctor opened his mouth, Wesley knew. L1 vertebra. Complete compression fracture. Severe damage to the spinal cord. Paralysis from the waist down. The man who had never stopped moving would never move the same way again. Before the accident, Wesley Grant had been unstoppable. That was not arrogance. It was simply fact. He had become the youngest CEO in the history of Grant Technologies at the age of 31, taking over a company his grandfather had built from nothing and his father had nearly destroyed through bad decisions and worse investments. Wesley had saved it, rebuilt it, transformed it into a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of will and an almost inhuman capacity for work. He had climbed mountains in Nepal during his vacations, run marathons in Tokyo just to prove he could, danced at charity galas until dawn, and then showed up at the office 4 hours later ready to close deals that would make headlines. His identity had been built on motion, on action, on the absolute certainty that there was no obstacle he could not overcome if he just pushed hard enough. Now he could not even stand without assistance. The cruelest part was the phantom sensations. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Wesley could have sworn he felt his toes tingling. He would throw off the blankets, stare at his legs, will them to move with every ounce of determination that had built his empire. Nothing. Just 2 useless limbs that belonged to a stranger. He had stopped looking in mirrors 3 months after the accident. The man staring back at him was someone he did not recognize. Someone hollow. Someone defeated. Someone he despised. His phone buzzed constantly with messages he never answered. His board of directors sent concerned emails he deleted without reading. His physical therapist showed up 3 times a week to torture him with exercises that seemed pointless, and Wesley went through the motions because it was easier than arguing. But he had stopped hoping, stopped believing that anything would ever change, until the intercom on his desk crackled to life. "Mr. Grant?" His assistant's voice was hesitant. "Your 2 o'clock is here." Wesley did not turn from the window. He said, "Send them away." "Sir, it is." His assistant paused awkwardly. "It is from the foster care agency. They said you requested this meeting personally." Wesley closed his eyes. He had forgotten. 2 weeks ago, in a moment of what he now recognized as temporary insanity, he had made a phone call. His lawyer had delivered news that cut through the numbness Wesley had wrapped around himself like armor. His older sister Margaret was dead. Car accident. A cruel irony that was not lost on him. They had not spoken in 7 years. 7 years of stubborn silence, of unresolved arguments, of pride on both sides that neither of them had been willing to swallow. Their father had played them against each other when they were young, and they had never fully recovered from the manipulation. Wesley had always told himself there would be time to fix things, time to reach out, time to apologize. Now there was no time left. But Margaret had left something behind. Someone behind. A 5-year-old daughter named Rosie who had been bounced between 3 foster homes in 6 months because no one wanted to keep her. No one wanted her because Rosie had not spoken a single word since her mother's death. Wesley's lawyer had called it selective mutism, a trauma response. Apparently the little girl had witnessed the accident that killed her mother, and she had simply stopped talking, stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping through the night. 3 families had tried to help her. 3 families had given up. And now the state was preparing to place her in a group home, where she would become just another statistic, just another broken child lost in the system. Something inside Wesley, some remnant of the man he used to be, had risen up and demanded action. He had made the phone call before he could talk himself out of it. Now he sat in his wheelchair, staring at the rain streaking down his windows, wondering what on earth he had been thinking. He could not even take care of himself. How was he supposed to take care of a traumatized child? Mr. Grant? His assistant's voice came again. Should I send them in? Wesley took a deep breath. He said yes. Send them in. The door opened, and Wesley maneuvered his wheelchair to face it. The social worker was a tired-looking woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her brown hair and a file folder thick enough to serve as a weapon. She walked into the office with the cautious efficiency of someone who had delivered bad news too many times to count. But Wesley barely noticed her. His attention was fixed entirely on the small figure hiding behind her legs. Rosie Grant had her mother's eyes. That was the first thing Wesley noticed. Large and dark brown, almost too big for her delicate face. The same eyes that had stared at him across the dinner table when they were children, before their father's mind games had driven them apart. Margaret's eyes in a 5-year-old face. Rosie's hair was tangled, a wild mess of auburn curls that suggested no one had properly brushed it in weeks. She wore a faded yellow dress that was at least one size too small, the hem frayed and the collar slightly torn. On her feet were scuffed white shoes that had seen better days. And clutched against her chest, held so tightly that her small knuckles had turned white, was a stuffed rabbit so worn that only one ear remained intact. She looked up at Wesley with an expression that made his chest tighten. Fear. Distrust. The hollow resignation of someone who had learned that hoping for good things only led to disappointment. He knew that look because he saw it in his own reflection every morning. The social worker, Patricia Webb according to her name tag, cleared her throat. She said, Mr. Grant, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. As we discussed on the phone, Rosie has had a difficult transition since her mother's passing. She has experienced some challenges in her previous placements, and we want to make sure that... Wesley interrupted her. He said, leave us. Patricia Webb blinked. She said, I am sorry. Wesley kept his eyes on Rosie. He said, I would like to speak with my niece alone. You can wait in the reception area. My assistant will bring you coffee. The social worker's expression flickered between uncertainty and professional obligation. She said, Mr. Grant, I am not sure that is appropriate. Given the circumstances and Rosie's current emotional state, it might be better if I stayed too. Wesley finally looked at her. His gaze was firm and unwavering. He said, Mrs. Webb, that little girl has spent 6 months being poked and prodded and examined by strangers who talk about her like she is not in the room. She has been shuffled from house to house, family to family, never belonging anywhere. The last thing she needs is another adult treating her like a case file instead of a human being. Patricia Webb opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. Wesley continued, I am her uncle. I am the only family she has left, and I would like 5 minutes alone with her before you hand me a stack of paperwork to sign. Is that acceptable? The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Patricia Webb nodded slowly. She said, Of course, Mr. Grant. She turned to Rosie and knelt down, her voice softening. I will be right outside, sweetheart. If you need anything at all, just come find me. Okay. Rosie did not respond. She did not nod or shake her head or give any indication that she had heard. She just clutched her one-eared rabbit and stared at Wesley with those enormous, haunted eyes. Patricia stood and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle. She said, 5 minutes. The door closed behind her, and then it was just the two of them. Wesley and Rosie stared at each other across the vast expanse of his corner office. The rain continued to streak down the windows. The city hummed far below. The clock on the wall ticked away seconds that felt like hours. The silence was thick enough to taste. Wesley had prepared several things to say. Speeches about family and belonging and new beginnings. Carefully crafted words designed to make a frightened child feel safe. But sitting here, looking at this tiny, broken creature who shared his blood. All his carefully crafted words evaporated like morning mist. What did you say to a child who had lost everything? What could you possibly offer someone whose world had already taught her that trusting people led to pain? Wesley had no answers. So instead of giving a speech, he simply told the truth. He said, "You do not have to talk. I know you do not want to. That is okay." Rosie's eyes widened slightly. It was the smallest reaction, barely perceptible, but Wesley caught it. A crack in the armor she had built around herself. Wesley maneuvered his wheelchair slowly, carefully, until he was closer to her eye level. The movement took more effort than he liked to admit. His arms were strong from months of pushing himself around, but transferring his weight required concentration. He managed it without grimacing. Barely. He said, "Can I tell you something? Something I do not tell most people?" Rosie did not respond, but she did not look away either. She was watching him with an intensity that seemed far too old for her 5 years. Wesley took that as permission. He said, "I cannot walk. My legs do not work anymore. There was an accident, and now I have to use this chair to get around." He paused, letting the words settle. He continued, "Ever since the accident, people look at me differently. They look at me like I am broken, like I am less than what I used to be, like they are waiting for me to fix myself or disappear." Rosie's lower lip trembled slightly. Her arms tightened around the stuffed rabbit. Wesley kept his voice gentle. He said, "I imagine people look at you the same way. Because you do not talk. They probably think something is wrong with you. They probably think you need to be fixed." For the first time, something shifted in Rosie's expression. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else. Recognition. Wesley leaned forward slightly. He said, "Here is the thing about being broken. Sometimes the pieces do not go back together the way they were before. Sometimes you try, and they just will not fit." He paused. He continued, "But sometimes, if you are patient enough, the pieces become something new. Something different. Maybe not what you expected, but something real. Something that is yours." Wesley extended his hand toward her. It hung in the air between them, an offering, a bridge. He said, "I am not going to promise you that everything will be perfect. I am not going to pretend I know how to be a father. I have never taken care of anyone except myself, and honestly, I have not been doing a great job of that lately either." A ghost of something that might have been understanding flickered across Rosie's face. Wesley continued, "But I can promise you this. I will never, ever make you feel like you are not enough exactly as you are. I will never ask you to be someone you are not. And I will never stop trying to figure this out, even when it gets hard." His hand remained extended. He said, "So what do you say? Want to try this together?" The moment hung suspended in the air. The rain drummed against the windows. The clock ticked. The world outside continued spinning. And then, slowly, hesitantly, Rosie's small fingers reached out and wrapped around Wesley's hand. She did not speak. She did not smile. But she held on. And something inside Wesley Grant, something that had been dead for 18 months, began to breathe again. If this moment is already touching your heart, I need you to hit that like button right now. That simple action tells me you are feeling what Wesley and Rosie are feeling. That maybe, just maybe, two broken pieces can come together and make something whole. Now let me tell you what happened when Wesley brought this silent little girl into his world. Because nothing went the way he expected. The first 3 weeks were chaos. Wesley had prepared for Rosie's arrival with the same meticulous attention to detail that had made him successful in business. He had hired an interior designer to transform one of the guest bedrooms into a princess paradise. Butterfly patterns on the canopy bed, fairy lights strung along the ceiling. A bookshelf stocked with every children's book that had good reviews. Soft toys arranged artfully on every surface. It was beautiful. It was perfect. Rosie took one look at it and refused to sleep there. Well, that was not entirely accurate. She would start the night in the princess room. Wesley or one of the staff would tuck her in, turn on the fairy lights, close the door gently. By 2 in the morning, without fail, Rosie would appear at Wesley's bedside. She did not knock. She did not cry out or call for him. She simply materialized like a small ghost, standing inches from his bed, staring at him with those enormous dark eyes until he woke up. The first time it happened, Wesley nearly had a heart attack. He had jerked awake to find Rosie's face inches from his own, her expression unreadable in the darkness. He had gasped, "What are you? How did you?" Then he had stopped himself, taken a breath, remembered his promise. He had said, "Nightmare?" No response. He had said, "Cannot sleep?" Still nothing. Wesley had looked at her for a long moment. The stuffed rabbit was clutched against her chest as always. Her eyes were dry, but there was something desperate in them. Something that begged for comfort she did not know how to ask for. He had said, "Do you want to sleep in here with me?" And without a word, Rosie had climbed onto the bed and curled up next to him like a small, wounded animal seeking warmth. Wesley had lain there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing slowly even out into sleep. His chest ached with emotions he could not name. That became their pattern, every single night. The food situation was equally challenging. Wesley had hired a private chef who specialized in child nutrition. The woman had prepared an impressive array of colorful, healthy, appealing meals designed to entice even the pickiest eater. Rosie refused to touch any of it. After 3 days of watching expensive organic vegetables go untouched, Wesley had finally asked Dorothy, the housekeeper, what Rosie had eaten at her previous foster homes. Dorothy had checked with the social worker. The answer came back: peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices. That was it. That was all Rosie would eat. Wesley had fired the private chef that afternoon and asked Dorothy to keep the kitchen stocked with bread, peanut butter, and apples. Problem solved. Sort of. Then there was the shoe situation. Rosie refused to wear shoes indoors. The moment she crossed the threshold of Wesley's Boston mansion, the shoes came off. It did not matter if guests were coming. It did not matter if the floors were cold. It did not matter how many times the staff gently suggested she put her shoes back on. The shoes came off. And of course, there was Mr. Buttons. Wesley had learned the name of the one-eared rabbit on the third day, quite by accident. He had asked Dorothy to wash the stuffed animal because it was frankly starting to smell. Dorothy had attempted to gently pry the rabbit from Rosie's arms. Rosie had not spoken, but she had screamed. It was a wordless sound of pure terror, a sound that had brought Wesley wheeling into the room faster than he had moved since the accident. Dorothy had looked mortified. She had said, "I am so sorry, Mr. Grant. I was just trying to." Wesley had held up his hand to stop her. He had turned to Rosie, who was now clutching the rabbit so tightly she was shaking. He had said, gently, "That is a very special rabbit." Rosie had stared at him, tears streaming down her face, still not speaking. Wesley had said, "Does he have a name?" For a long moment, nothing. Then the smallest nod. Wesley had said, "Can you show me his name? Maybe point to something that starts with the same letter?" Rosie had looked around the room. Her eyes had landed on the buttons on Wesley's shirt. Wesley had felt something click into place. He had said, "Mr. Buttons?" Rosie had nodded. Wesley had turned to Dorothy. He had said, "Mr. Buttons does not get washed unless Rosie says it is okay. Understood?" Dorothy had nodded quickly and retreated. From that moment on, Mr. Buttons went everywhere Rosie went. And no one touched him except Wesley, and only when Rosie specifically handed him over. The household staff did not know how to handle any of this. Dorothy kept trying to impose structure and schedules because that was what children needed, right? Bedtimes and meal times and activity times. Rosie retreated further into herself every time Dorothy tried. The driver attempted friendly conversation during trips to doctor appointments and meetings with the social worker. Rosie stared at him blankly, clutching Mr. Buttons, offering nothing. By the 4th week, Wesley had made a decision. He had called a staff meeting in his study. Dorothy, the driver, the remaining household employees all gathered, uncertain and uncomfortable. Wesley had said, "Thank you all for your efforts over the past month. I know this transition has been difficult. However, I have decided to make some changes." He had looked at each of them in turn. He had continued, effective immediately, I am reducing the household staff to essential personnel only. Dorothy, you will remain, but your duties will be limited to cleaning and laundry. The rest of you will receive 3 months severance and excellent references. The driver had spoken up. He had said, Mr. Grant, sir, are you sure? With your condition, you need. Wesley had cut him off. He had said, what I need is for my niece to feel safe in her own home. And right now, she does not feel safe because there are too many strangers trying to interact with her. He had paused. He had continued, I appreciate your concern for my condition, but I have been managing it for 18 months. I will continue to manage it with less help if that is what Rosie needs. The meeting had ended. The staff had dispersed, and by the end of the week, the mansion was quiet. Just Wesley, Rosie, and Dorothy moving around each other like planets in a silent orbit. The physical therapy sessions continued 3 times a week. Wesley hated them with a passion that surprised even him. Every session was a reminder of what he could not feel, could not do, could not control. The therapist, a relentlessly optimistic man named James, would manipulate Wesley's legs through range of motion exercises while chattering about neuroplasticity and the importance of maintaining muscle tone. Wesley went through the motions because the alternative was atrophy and blood clots and a host of other complications he did not want to think about. But he had stopped hoping these sessions would lead anywhere. His doctors had been clear. The damage was done. He would never walk again. During one session, about 5 weeks after Rosie's arrival, James had paused in the middle of an exercise. He had said, "Can I say something, Mr. Grant? As someone who has worked with you for over a year now?" Wesley had stared at the ceiling. He had said, "I suspect you will say it whether I give permission or not." James had smiled slightly. He had said, "You need help with the little girl. A child specialist. Someone trained to work with trauma." Wesley had said, flatly, "I have interviewed 12 candidates. None of them were right." James had raised an eyebrow. He had said, "Right for who? You or Rosie?" Wesley had not answered because he did not have an answer. The candidates had all been wrong. Every single one. They had arrived in designer suits with leather portfolios full of credentials and references and 5-year developmental plans. They had spoken in clinical terms about attachment disorders and selective mutism and therapeutic interventions. They had used words like behavioral modification and trauma-informed care and graduated exposure therapy. And every single one of them had looked at Rosie like she was a puzzle to be solved, a problem to be fixed, an equation that just needed the right formula. None of them had seen her, the real her, the small, frightened, desperately lonely little girl hiding behind the silence. Wesley had rejected every single one, and now he was stuck. He had promised Rosie he would never give up on her, but he had no idea what to do next. Late at night, with Rosie curled up beside him in his bed, Wesley would stare at the ceiling and wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Maybe the social worker had been right. Maybe he was not equipped for this. Maybe a man who could not walk, who could barely take care of himself, who had spent 18 months drowning in bitterness and despair, had no business trying to save anyone. But then Rosie would shift in her sleep, her small hand reaching out to rest on his arm, as if to reassure herself he was still there. And Wesley would remember his promise. He would not give up. He could not give up. He just needed to find the right person to help him keep his word. The rain was particularly heavy on the Tuesday that changed everything. Wesley sat in his study, exhausted from another sleepless night, staring at the resume in front of him without really seeing it. Another candidate. Another interview. Another disappointment waiting to happen. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. She said, "Mr. Grant, your 3 o'clock is here." Wesley glanced at the clock. It was 3:15. He said, into the intercom, "She is late." "Yes, sir." "Should I reschedule?" Wesley sighed. He said no. Send her in. He expected another polished professional in an expensive suit. Another portfolio full of credentials. Another person who would talk about Rosie like she was a case study rather than a child. The woman who walked through his door was nothing like that. She was wearing jeans and a cable knit sweater. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail that suggested she had done it quickly and without a mirror. She carried nothing except a worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and she was apologizing before she even finished walking through the door. She said, I know, I am so sorry I am late. It was completely unprofessional and I understand if you want to reschedule." Wesley raised an eyebrow. He said, "You are Megan Foster?" She nodded, slightly out of breath. She said yes. "Again, I am really sorry." She hesitated, then seemed to decide she might as well tell the truth. "There was a kitten stuck in a storm drain about 3 blocks from here. Orange tabby, maybe 8 weeks old, absolutely terrified. I could not just leave it there." Wesley stared at her. He said, "A kitten?" Megan nodded. She said, "I know it sounds ridiculous, but it was crying, and the drain was filling up with rainwater, and I had to help." She set down her bag and knelt on the floor, completely ignoring Wesley and starting to rummage through the canvas. She continued, "I dropped it at the emergency vet on my way here. They're going to check it out and find it a home. Anyway, I wanted to show you something." Wesley watched her with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant curiosity. She pulled a battered paperback book from the bag and held it up triumphantly. She said, "Do you know this one?" Wesley looked at the cover. It was a simple illustration of a small bird with a crooked wing, standing at the edge of a cliff. He said, reading the title aloud, "The Bird Who Could Not Fly South." "I do not recognize it." Megan's face softened. She said, "It is out of print now. My grandmother used to read it to me when I was little, every night before bed. It is about a bird who gets injured during migration season. Her wing is broken, and she cannot fly south with her flock." Wesley found himself listening despite his skepticism. Megan continued, "All the other birds leave her behind. They assume she is going to die. That is just what happens to birds who cannot fly south. They freeze, or they starve, or they get eaten by predators." She paused, her green eyes meeting Wesley's. She said, "But this bird does not die. She finds a different way to survive the winter. She builds herself a little shelter under a fallen log. She makes friends with a family of rabbits who share their food with her. She learns to find seeds buried under the snow." Wesley's throat felt tight. He was not sure why. Megan said, "And when spring comes and the flock returns, expecting to find her bones, they find her alive. Changed, but alive. And here's the thing. She does not rejoin the flock. She realizes she does not need them anymore. She has found a new home. A different home. One she built for herself." The silence stretched between them. Wesley said, quietly, "Why are you showing me this?" Megan looked at him directly. Her green eyes held no pity, no false sympathy, just a clear, steady understanding. She said, "Because I think you and your niece might need to hear that story. Both of you." Before Wesley could respond, a small sound made them both turn toward the doorway. Rosie was standing there. She must have snuck down from her room without anyone noticing. She was barefoot, of course, her yellow dress slightly rumpled. Mr. Buttons was clutched against her chest as always. But she was not looking at Wesley. She was not looking at Megan. She was staring at the book. Her eyes were fixed on the cover illustration of the bird with the crooked wing, and her expression was something Wesley had never seen before. Interest, curiosity, longing. Megan smiled gently. She said, in a soft voice, "Would you like to look at it, sweetheart?" She held out the book. Rosie hesitated. Wesley held his breath. The moment stretched, and then Rosie crossed the room. She took the book from Megan's hands. She settled herself on the floor right there in the middle of Wesley's study. And she began to trace the outline of the bird with one small finger. Wesley watched his silent, withdrawn niece voluntarily interact with a stranger for the first time in months. His decision was instant. He said, "You are hired." Megan's eyebrow rose. She said, "You have not even asked about my qualifications." Wesley did not take his eyes off Rosie. He said, "I do not care about your qualifications. Whatever you just did, I need you to keep doing it." Megan looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Rosie, still absorbed in the book. She said, softly, I think I can do that. And that was how Megan Foster walked into their lives, 15 minutes late, smelling faintly of wet kitten, carrying nothing but a worn-out book and the kind of hope Wesley had forgotten existed. Can I be honest with you right now? This moment, right here, is when everything started to change. Not just for Rosie, not just for Wesley, for all of them. This is when light started to creep back into a house that had been dark for far too long. If you are curious about what happens next, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. And while you are at it, share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about hope today. Trust me, they will thank you for it. Now let me tell you how Megan began to work her magic. She moved into the guest cottage on Wesley's property the following week. It was a small house that had been empty since before the accident, and it took Dorothy 2 days to make it habitable. Megan arrived with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and the orange tabby kitten she had rescued from the storm drain. She had named him Butterscotch. Wesley watched from his study window as she unpacked, wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. On her first official day, Wesley expected her to present a plan, a schedule, some kind of structured approach to helping Rosie heal. Instead, Megan made cookies. She had taken over the kitchen by mid-morning, and soon the entire mansion smelled of butter and vanilla and chocolate chips. Dorothy watched with obvious disapproval from the doorway. Wesley wheeled himself into the kitchen around noon. He said, "I was expecting something more clinical." Megan did not look up from the mixing bowl. She said, "Were you?" Wesley said, "You have degrees in child psychology and trauma therapy. I assumed there would be some kind of methodology involved." Megan finally looked at him. There was a smudge of flour on her cheek. She said, "There is a methodology. Watch." She pulled a tray of cookies from the oven and set them on the counter to cool. Then she waited. Wesley was about to ask what exactly he was supposed to be watching when movement in the doorway caught his attention. Rosie was standing at the edge of the kitchen. She was still holding Mr. Buttons, but her attention was fixed on the cookies. Her nose twitched slightly. Megan pretended not to notice her. She started humming softly and arranging the cookies on a plate. Rosie took a small step into the kitchen. Then another. Then another. She stopped about 2 feet from the counter, staring at the cookies with barely concealed longing. Megan glanced at her casually. She said, "Those are still too hot to eat. But if you want to wait, I can give you one when they cool down." Rosie did not respond verbally, but she also did not leave. She stood there, watching, waiting. Wesley watched in amazement as his niece, who had barely tolerated the presence of strangers for months, voluntarily stayed in the same room as Megan for nearly 20 minutes. When the cookies finally cooled, Megan placed one on a small plate and slid it across the counter toward Rosie. She said, "There you go, sweetheart. Let me know if you like it." Rosie picked up the cookie. She looked at it. She looked at Megan. She looked at Wesley. Then she took a bite. It was the first thing besides peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices that Wesley had seen her eat in weeks. Megan caught Wesley's eye and smiled. She said, softly, "That is the methodology." Over the following days, Wesley began to understand what Megan was doing. She was not trying to fix Rosie. She was not trying to force her out of her shell or push her toward milestones or measure her progress against some clinical timeline. She was simply existing in Rosie's world. She read books out loud, not to Rosie specifically, but just sitting in the garden or the living room, reading in a soft voice. Sometimes Rosie drifted nearby to listen. Sometimes she did not. She planted flowers in the garden, narrating what she was doing as if to no one in particular. Rosie would sometimes appear and watch from a distance, still clutching Mr. Buttons, not participating but present. She baked cookies and bread and simple cakes, filling the house with warmth and the smell of home. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rosie began to emerge. She still did not speak, not a single word, but she started making eye contact. Brief glances at first, then longer looks. She started joining Megan in the kitchen, not helping exactly, but standing nearby, watching the process. She started leaving Mr. Buttons on her pillow sometimes, not clutching him every waking moment. Each tiny change was a victory. Wesley found himself watching these moments from doorways and windows, afraid to get too close, afraid to break whatever fragile spell Megan was weaving. But Rosie had other plans. About 3 weeks after Megan's arrival, Wesley was in his study pretending to work on quarterly reports that no longer held any meaning for him. The numbers blurred on the screen. His mind was elsewhere. A soft knock at the door made him look up. Rosie was standing in the doorway. She was holding the bird who could not fly south. The book that Megan had brought that first day. The book with the crooked-winged bird on the cover. Wesley's heart stuttered in his chest. He said, "Hi, sweetheart." Rosie walked toward him. Not hesitantly, not slowly, but with purpose. She reached his wheelchair and, without asking permission, climbed into his lap. Wesley froze. This was new. This was completely new. Rosie settled herself against his chest, opened the book to the first page, and looked up at him expectantly. Wesley's voice was rough when he spoke. He said, "You want me to read to you?" Rosie nodded. Wesley looked at the book, then at his niece, then at the book again. He cleared his throat and began to read. Once upon a time, there was a small bird with feathers the color of autumn leaves. She was not the biggest bird in the flock, or the fastest, or the strongest. But she had a good heart, and she loved to fly. He read the entire book. Every page. Every word. When he finished, Rosie looked up at him. Then she turned back to the first page. Wesley understood. He read it again. And then again. By the time he finished reading the book for the third time, Rosie had fallen asleep against his chest. Her small hand was curled around the lapel of his jacket. Her breathing was deep and even. Wesley sat perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever was happening. There were tears streaming down his face. He could not have explained why if someone had asked. It was not sadness exactly. It was something else. Something bigger. It was the feeling of ice beginning to crack after a very long winter. Movement in the doorway made him look up. Megan was standing there. She had come to take Rosie up for her nap. She took in the scene before her. Wesley in his wheelchair, tears on his face, his niece asleep in his arms. The worn book resting on Rosie's lap. Megan did not say a word. She just smiled. That sad warm smile that Wesley was beginning to associate with her. She stepped forward quietly and helped him transfer Rosie without waking her, lifting the sleeping child with practiced ease. She said, in a whisper, "I will put her down for her nap." Wesley nodded. He could not speak. Megan carried Rosie out of the room, Mr. Buttons tucked securely under the little girl's arm. Wesley stared at the doorway for a long time after they disappeared. When Megan returned 15 minutes later, he had not moved. She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down. She said, quietly, "She chose you." Wesley shook his head. He said, his voice barely a whisper, "I do not understand." Megan leaned forward. She said, "Rosie has been surrounded by adults her entire life. Her mother, foster parents, social workers, teachers, therapists, people who were supposed to take care of her, supposed to protect her." She paused. She continued, "Every single one of them let her down. Maybe not on purpose. Maybe not through any fault of their own. But she lost her mother. She was ripped away from everything familiar. She was placed in home after home where nothing felt safe." Megan's green eyes held Wesley's. She said, "She has learned that adults are not to be trusted. That letting people in leads to pain. That it is safer to stay silent, to hide, to disappear." Wesley waited. Megan said, "But she climbed into your lap today. She asked you to read to her. She fell asleep in your arms." She smiled. She said, "Do you understand what that means? She chose you, Wesley. Despite everything she has been through, despite every adult who has failed her, she chose to trust you." Wesley's throat was so tight, he could barely breathe. Megan continued, "That little girl is healing. Slowly. In her own time. In her own way." She paused. She said, "And I think maybe she is not the only one." Their eyes met. Something passed between them. An understanding. A recognition. A possibility. But Wesley looked away first. He said, stiffly, "I should get back to work." Megan stood. If she was disappointed, she did not show it. She said, "Of course. I will have dinner ready at 6. She walked toward the door, then paused. She said, over her shoulder, "Wesley, it is okay to feel things. It does not make you weak." Then she was gone. Wesley sat alone in his study, surrounded by reports he did not care about and numbers that meant nothing. But for the first time in 18 months, he did not feel completely empty. Something was changing inside him. He was not ready to name it yet, not ready to acknowledge it, but it was there, growing, warming, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, the pieces were starting to fit together again. Not the way they had been before, but into something new, something different, something that might actually be worth living for. 3 months had passed since Megan walked into their lives with a rescued kitten and a worn-out book about a bird who could not fly south. 3 months of quiet mornings and gentle routines. 3 months of cookies baking in the kitchen and flowers blooming in the garden. 3 months of small victories that added up to something bigger than Wesley had dared to hope for. Rosie was different now. She still did not speak. Not a single word had crossed her lips since her mother's death. But she was present in a way she had not been before. She made eye contact. She smiled sometimes, small fleeting smiles that disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. She had stopped clutching Mr. Buttons every waking moment, though the one-eared rabbit was never far from reach. She had started sleeping in her own room again. Not every night, but most nights. And on the nights when she appeared at Wesley's bedside, her eyes were less haunted than they used to be. Wesley was different too, though he was slower to recognize it. He no longer dreaded his physical therapy sessions with quite the same intensity. He had started attending video conferences with his board of directors again, something he had avoided for months. He had even laughed a few times, real laughter that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Megan had noticed. She noticed everything, but she never pushed. She never pointed out the changes or made him feel self-conscious about them. She simply continued being herself, warm and patient and steady as the sunrise. It was a Sunday morning in early spring when everything changed. The weather was perfect. One of those rare days in Boston when the sky was impossibly blue and the air smelled like new beginnings. Wesley had insisted on transferring himself from his wheelchair to a bench in the garden, despite his physical therapist's concerns about overexertion. He wanted to feel the sun on his face. He wanted to sit somewhere other than his wheelchair for a few minutes. He wanted to pretend, just for a moment, that he was a normal man enjoying a normal morning. The transfer had been difficult. His arms had trembled with the effort, but he had managed it, and now he sat on the stone bench, his useless legs stretched out before him, his face tilted toward the sky. Megan was nearby, pruning roses with the same quiet focus she brought to everything. She wore a simple sundress and her hair was loose around her shoulders. Wesley found himself watching her more often than he should. Rosie was playing in the grass about 20 feet away. She had brought Mr. Buttons outside with her, and she was arranging a little picnic for the stuffed rabbit using leaves and flower petals as pretend food. The scene was so peaceful, so perfect, that Wesley almost did not want to breathe for fear of breaking it. And then a butterfly appeared. It was a monarch, orange and black and impossibly delicate. It floated through the garden on the spring breeze, dipping and rising, dancing through the sunlight. It landed on Rosie's knee. Wesley watched as his knees froze completely. Her hands stopped moving. Her body went still. Her enormous dark eyes fixed on the tiny creature resting on her skin. The butterfly's wings opened and closed slowly. Once, twice. Rosie stared at it with an expression of pure wonder. And then, in a voice rusty from months of silence, she whispered a single word. Beautiful. Wesley's head snapped up so fast he nearly lost his balance on the bench. Across the garden, Megan dropped her pruning shears. They hit the ground with a metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Rosie looked up at them with wide eyes, seeming almost as surprised as they were by the sound that had come from her own mouth. The butterfly lifted off from her knee and floated away, its purpose served. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Wesley held out his arms. He said, his voice rough with emotion, "Come here, sweetheart." Rosie scrambled to her feet. And then she did something Wesley had never seen her do before. She ran. She ran across the garden, laughing, actually laughing, a sound like bells and sunshine and everything good in the world. She threw herself into Wesley's arms with such force that she nearly knocked him off the bench. He caught her. He held her so tight, he was afraid he might break her. She said, again, louder this time, "Beautiful, beautiful butterfly, Uncle Wesley. Did you see it? Did you see?" Tears were streaming down Wesley's face. He did not try to stop them. He did not care. He said, "I saw, sweetheart. I saw everything." Over Rosie's shoulder, his eyes found Megan's. She was crying too, both hands pressed over her mouth, her green eyes shining with a joy so pure it was almost painful to look at. Something cracked open in Wesley's chest. Something he had boarded up 18 months ago, convinced he would never need it again. Hope. Real hope. The kind that does not just whisper that things might get better, but shouts it from the rooftops. After that first word, Rosie could not stop. It was like a dam had broken. All the words she had held inside for 6 months came flooding out in an unstoppable torrent. She talked about the butterfly. She talked about Mr. Buttons. She talked about the bird who could not fly south and how she was glad the bird found a new home, because everyone deserves a home. She talked about cookies and flowers and the color of the sky. She asked questions. So many questions. Why is the grass green? How do butterflies know where to go? Can rabbits really share their food with birds? Why do you have to sit in that chair with the wheels? Wesley answered every single question, even the ones that made his heart ache. He said, when she asked about the wheelchair, "I was in an accident. My legs got hurt, and now they do not work the way they used to." Rosie considered this with the serious intensity only a 5-year-old can muster. She said, "Does it hurt?" Wesley thought about how to answer honestly. He said, "Not anymore. Not the way it used to." Rosie nodded slowly. She said, "Mommy got hurt in an accident too. But she did not get a chair with wheels. She just went away." Wesley felt his throat close up. He said, very gently, "I know, sweetheart. I am so sorry about your mommy." Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him with those enormous brown eyes, her mother's eyes, and said something that broke Wesley's heart into a million pieces and put it back together again all at once. She said, "It is okay. I have you now. And Megan. And Mr. Buttons. We are like the bird. We found a different home." Wesley held her close and let the tears fall. Over the following weeks, Rosie's transformation continued at a pace that amazed everyone. She started sleeping in her own room every night. She started eating foods other than peanut butter sandwiches, though those remained her favorite. She started making friends at the preschool Wesley enrolled her in, and she started calling Wesley something new. The first time it happened, they were eating breakfast together. Megan had made pancakes shaped like butterflies, a new weekend tradition. Rosie had looked up from her plate, syrup on her chin, and said, "Daddy, can I have more orange juice?" Wesley had frozen with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Rosie had not seemed to notice. She had just waited expectantly for her orange juice. Megan had caught Wesley's eye across the table. Her expression was soft with understanding. Wesley had set down his coffee cup. His hands were shaking slightly. He had said, "Of course, sweetheart." He had poured her more orange juice. And from that moment on, he was Daddy, not Uncle Wesley, not Mr. Grant. Daddy. Rosie had chosen him. Fully, completely, irrevocably. And Wesley, the man who had spent 18 months convinced he had nothing left to offer anyone, had been chosen right back. Something was happening to Wesley's body. It started about 2 weeks after Rosie spoke her first word. A tingling sensation in his left foot during a morning physical therapy session. He had ignored it at first. He had felt phantom sensations before. His damaged nerves playing tricks on him, making him feel things that were not real. But this was different. The tingling persisted. It spread to his right foot, then to his ankles. He said nothing to anyone. He was afraid to hope, afraid that speaking it out loud would make it disappear. But within a week, He could feel pressure on his thighs. Not full sensation, not normal sensation, but something. A dull awareness that had not been there before. His physical therapist noticed something during their regular session. James said, frowning slightly, "Your muscle response seems different today. Can you try to flex your left foot for me?" Wesley concentrated. He focused every ounce of his attention on his left foot. Nothing happened. And then, so slightly that he almost missed it, his big toe twitched. James stared at Wesley's foot. Then he stared at Wesley. He said, "Did you feel that?" Wesley's heart was pounding. He said, "I do not know. Maybe. I think so." James immediately called Wesley's neurologist. Within 3 days, Wesley was back at the hospital for a battery of tests. The neurologist, a serious woman in her 60s who had delivered Wesley's original prognosis with clinical detachment, stared at the new scans with an expression Wesley had never seen on her face before. She said, "This is unprecedented." Wesley sat in his wheelchair, hands gripping the armrests. He said, "What does that mean?" She turned to face him. She said, "When you came to me 18 months ago, you had significant nerve damage at the L1 injury site. The compression had caused what appeared to be complete interruption of signal transmission to your lower extremities." She paused. She continued, "These new scans show something different. There is evidence of neural regeneration that should not be possible given the severity of your original injury." Wesley felt the room tilt slightly. He said, "What are you saying?" The neurologist took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. She said, "I am saying that I do not have a medical explanation for what I am seeing. The human nervous system does not typically regenerate in this manner. There are experimental treatments that have shown limited promise in some cases, but you have not undergone any of those treatments." She looked at him directly. She said, "I am saying, Mr. Grant, that something is happening to your body that defies my understanding of spinal cord injuries." Wesley stared at her. He said, "But it is possible. What I am feeling is real." The neurologist nodded slowly. She said, "Yes, what you are feeling appears to be real. And based on these scans, I believe there is a possibility, that with intensive therapy, you may regain some degree of function." She held up a hand before Wesley could respond. She continued, "I want to be clear. I am not promising you will walk again. The damage was severe. But I am saying that I would not have believed any recovery was possible based on your original scans, and these new scans tell a different story." Wesley left the hospital that afternoon with a new physical therapy plan and something he had not felt in 18 months. Real, tangible, medically supported hope. He did not tell anyone about the new prognosis. Not Megan. Not Rosie. Not Dorothy. He was afraid. Afraid that saying it out loud would jinx it. Afraid that getting everyone's hopes up would only lead to deeper disappointment if the recovery stalled. So he kept it secret. He threw himself into his physical therapy with a determination that surprised even James. 3 sessions a week became 5. He added exercises on his own in the evenings, after Rosie went to bed. The progress was agonizingly slow. But it was progress. Within a month, he could feel his entire legs. Not perfectly, not the way he used to, but enough to know they were there. Within 2 months, he could move his toes on command. Then his ankles. James brought in parallel bars. Wesley spent hours between them, his arms shaking with effort, trying to coax his legs into bearing his weight. He fell. Over and over again. His legs would give out without warning, and he would crash to the floor, bruised and frustrated and embarrassed. But he got up every time. He got up and he tried again. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, he was preparing something. A surprise. A gift. He was going to walk again. And when he did, he wanted the first person to see it to be someone who had given him a reason to try. Meanwhile, something else was growing. Wesley and Megan had developed a rhythm over the past months. They ate breakfast together every morning. They put Rosie to bed together every night. They spent evenings talking after Rosie fell asleep, conversations that stretched longer and longer as the weeks went by. They talked about everything and nothing, about books and music and the places they had always wanted to travel. about their childhoods, their mistakes, their regrets. Megan told Wesley about her grandmother, the one who had given her the bird book. She told him about losing her parents young, about being raised by that grandmother, about finding purpose in helping children who were as lost as she had once been. Wesley told Megan about his father's manipulation, about the rift with his sister that he would never be able to heal. He told her about the accident, about the dark months afterward, about how close he had come to giving up entirely. He said, "One night, Rosie saved my life. I know that sounds dramatic, but it is true. Before she came, I was just existing, going through the motions, waiting to die." Megan was quiet for a moment. She said, "And now?" Wesley looked at her, really looked at her. He said, "Now I have something to live for." Their eyes met. The moment stretched. Wesley wanted to reach for her hand. He wanted to tell her that she was part of what he was living for now, maybe the biggest part. But he could not. Not yet. He had to show her first. He had to walk to her. Megan said, softly, "Whatever happened to you, Wesley Grant, I am glad it led you here." Wesley said, "So am I." The silence that followed was comfortable, warm, full of things unsaid but deeply felt. It was almost exactly 1 year after Rosie's adoption when Wesley was finally ready. The day was perfect. Another impossibly blue sky. Another spring morning that smelled like new beginnings. Almost a perfect mirror of the day Rosie had spoken her first word. Wesley had asked Dorothy to keep Rosie occupied inside for a few hours. He had told Megan he needed to speak with her privately in the garden. Megan was sitting on the stone bench where Wesley used to sit, reading a book. She looked up when she heard footsteps approaching, and then she dropped the book entirely. Wesley was walking toward her. Actually walking. On his own 2 legs. He had a cane for support, and his gait was uneven, but he was upright. He was moving forward. He was walking. Megan stood so quickly she nearly tripped. She breathed, "Wesley." "Oh my God." Wesley kept walking toward her. Each step was concentrated effort. Each step was a small miracle. He said, "I have been practicing in secret. For months. I wanted to surprise you." Tears were forming in Megan's eyes. She said, "You are walking. You are actually walking." Wesley reached her. He was slightly out of breath from the effort, but he was standing in front of her under his own power. He said, "There is something I need to say. Something I have been wanting to say for a long time." Megan stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Wesley took a breath. He said, "I have spent the last year watching you save my niece. Watching you bring light into a house that had forgotten what light looked like. Watching you bake cookies and plant flowers and read stories as if those small acts could change the world." He paused. He continued, "And the thing is, they did. They changed Rosie's world. They changed my world. You came into our lives with a rescued kitten and a worn-out book, and you taught us both that being broken does not mean being beyond repair. It just means finding a different way." Megan pressed a hand to her heart. Wesley said, "I did not believe in miracles before I met you. I did not believe that life could give second chances. I thought my best days were behind me, that I would spend the rest of my life just trying to survive." He shook his head. He continued, "But then Rosie took my hand, and you handed her that book. And somewhere between then and now, I started believing again. I started hoping again. I started living again." He reached for her hand. He said, "I am not asking you to fix me, Megan. I am not asking you to save me. You have already done both of those things without even trying." Megan laughed through her tears. Wesley continued, "I am asking you something different. I am asking you to love me, to let me love you back, to be a family with me and Rosie, officially, permanently, forever." He released her hand and reached into his pocket. Megan's eyes went wide. Wesley said, "I know this is not how these things usually go. I know most people do not propose to their daughter's caregiver after only knowing them for a year. But nothing about our story has been usual." He pulled out a small velvet box. He said, "You came into my life 15 minutes late, smelling like wet kitten, and you changed everything. You showed me that the pieces do not have to go back together the way they were before. That sometimes they become something new, something better. He lowered himself to one knee. The movement was difficult, and his legs shook with the effort, but he managed it. He opened the box, revealing a simple diamond ring. He said, "Megan Foster, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and Rosie's mother, and my partner in whatever comes next?" Megan was fully crying now. Her hands were pressed over her mouth. Her whole body was trembling. She said, through tears and laughter, "You remembered the kitten in the storm drain." Wesley smiled. He said, "I remember everything about you. Every single thing." Megan reached down and took his face in her hands. She said yes. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Wesley slid the ring onto her finger. Then, with her help, he got back to his feet. He actually stood, and kissed her properly for the first time. From the window of the house, a 5-year-old girl was watching. Rosie had escaped Dorothy's supervision and snuck to the window when she heard voices in the garden. Now she stood with her nose pressed against the glass, Mr. Buttons clutched in her arms, a grin spreading across her face so wide her cheeks hurt. She whispered, "He did it, Mr. Buttons. He is walking, just like the bird in the book. He found a different way." Mr. Buttons, now sporting 2 ears again thanks to Megan's sewing skills, did not respond. But if a stuffed rabbit could smile, this one was smiling. The wedding took place in the same garden where everything important had happened. It was a warm afternoon in June. The roses were in full bloom. A canopy of white silk had been erected over the ceremony space, and white chairs were arranged in neat rows for the small gathering of guests. There were no celebrities, no business associates, no distant relatives who only showed up for obligation, just a handful of genuine friends. Dorothy, who had stayed on as permanent housekeeper. James, the physical therapist, who had worked miracles with Wesley's recovery. The neurologist who still could not explain what had happened. A few of Megan's old colleagues from her child psychology days. And at the front of the aisle, waiting with barely contained excitement, was Rosie. She was the flower girl, a title she took very seriously. She wore a white dress covered in tiny embroidered butterflies. Her auburn curls had been brushed until they shone. In one hand, she held a basket of rose petals. In the other, she held Mr. Buttons, because some traditions could not be broken. The string quartet began to play. Wesley appeared at the entrance to the garden aisle. He was not in a wheelchair. He was standing tall, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit. He carried no cane. His doctors had said he still needed one, but Wesley had decided that today, this day, he would walk unaided. Every step was careful. Every step was deliberate. But he did not falter. The guests rose to their feet, and more than a few of them were crying. This was a man who had been told he would never walk again. A man who had given up on life. A man who had been as broken as a person could be without shattering completely. And he was walking down the aisle to marry the woman who had helped put him back together. He reached the front and turned to face the entrance. Megan appeared. She wore a simple white dress that flowed like water around her. Her honey blonde hair was loose around her shoulders. She carried a bouquet of white roses mixed with wildflowers. She was crying before she even started walking. So was Wesley. So was almost everyone in the garden. Megan walked toward him, her steps steady despite the tears, her smile so bright it could have lit up the darkest night. She reached him. Their eyes met. For a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. The officiant cleared his throat. He said, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Wesley Grant and Megan Foster." The ceremony was simple. Traditional vows spoken with genuine feeling. Rings exchanged with trembling hands. Promises made that both of them intended to keep for the rest of their lives. When the officiant finally said the words everyone was waiting for, his voice rang out across the garden. He said, "By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Wesley pulled Megan into his arms and kissed her as the guests erupted in applause. And then a small voice cut through the celebration. Rosie shouted, "Wait, wait, I want to be in the kiss too." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Rosie abandoned her flower basket and ran toward them, Mr. Buttons flapping in the breeze. She threw her arms around both of their legs, looking up at them with shining eyes. She declared, "Family. We are a real family now." Wesley bent down and scooped her up in his arms. Megan wrapped her arms around both of them. Wesley said, softly, "We always were, sweetheart. You just reminded us." The three of them stood there in the afternoon light, wrapped in each other's arms. The guests continued to applaud. The string quartet began to play something soft and joyful. And butterflies, as if summoned by the memory of that first spoken word, danced around them in the summer air. The reception was held in the garden as the sun began to set. Tables had been set up under strings of twinkling lights. Good food was served, good wine was poured, and good conversation filled the evening air. Wesley danced with Megan, their first dance as husband and wife. His steps were still careful, still deliberate, but he stayed upright the entire time. Then Rosie demanded a dance with her daddy, and Wesley obliged, lifting her up so her feet rested on top of his while they swayed to the music. Speeches were given. Toasts were made. Stories were told about the impossible journey that had brought these three people together. But as the evening wore on, Wesley found himself stepping away from the celebration for a moment. He walked, still slightly unsteady but growing stronger every day, to the edge of the garden. He looked up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Megan appeared beside him. She slipped her hand into his. She said, "Penny for your thoughts?" Wesley smiled. He said, "I was just thinking about how different everything is from a year ago." Megan squeezed his hand. She said, "Tell me." Wesley was quiet for a moment. He said, "A year ago, I sat in that office 42 stories above the city and watched the world move without me. I had convinced myself that my life was over, that I had nothing left to offer anyone, that I was just taking up space until I died." He turned to look at her. He continued, "And then a social worker brought me a 5-year-old girl who would not speak. A little girl that everyone else had given up on. A little girl who looked at me and saw something worth trusting." His voice grew rougher. He said, "I did not save her, Megan. She saved me. She reminded me that broken does not mean worthless, that the pieces can become something new." Megan's eyes were shining in the starlight. Wesley said, "And then you came, with your kitten and your book and your patience. You showed us both that love does not fix people. It just gives them a reason to fix themselves." He cupped her face in his hands. He said, "I love you, Mrs. Grant. I love the life we are building. I love who I am becoming because of you and Rosie." Megan smiled through fresh tears. She said, "I love you too. More than I have words for." They kissed under the stars while their daughter chased fireflies in the garden behind them. And somewhere, in the inexplicable mathematics of love and healing and second chances, the universe smiled. If this story touched your heart, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now. Not for me, but for everyone out there who needs to hear that broken does not mean beyond repair. That giving up is not the only option. That sometimes, the miracle you are waiting for is disguised as the thing you least expect. Share this video with someone who is going through a hard time right now. Someone who has lost hope. Someone who has forgotten that they matter. Trust me, they need to hear this story. And if you are not subscribed to this channel yet, what are you waiting for? Join this family. We share stories like this every day. Stories that remind us what it means to be human. Stories that make us laugh and cry and believe in better days. Now I want to ask you something I ask at the end of every story. On a scale from 0 to 10, what would you rate this story? Drop your number in the comments below. I read every single one. And tell me, what was your favorite part? Was it the moment Rosie spoke her first word? Was it Wesley's proposal? Was it that first meeting where two broken souls reached out and held on to each other? I want to know what moved you. I want to know what made you feel something. Because here is what I believe. I believe that stories have power. I believe that the right story, told at the right moment, can change a life, can remind someone that they are not alone, can give someone permission to hope again. Maybe this story was meant for you today. Maybe you are going through something hard right now. Maybe you are feeling broken and wondering if the pieces will ever fit back together. If that is you, let me tell you something. Sometimes the people no one else wants become life's greatest gifts. Sometimes broken things mend stronger at the seams. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, a silent 5-year-old girl and a woman with a worn-out storybook can teach a man in a wheelchair how to walk again. Not just with his legs, but with his heart. I will see you in the next story. Until then, remember this. The miracle you are waiting for might already be standing right in front of you. You just have to be brave enough to reach out and hold on.